Have you ever considered that the most desired events in our lives happen precisely when we stop desperately pursuing them? It might seem paradoxical, since we are taught from childhood to actively pursue goals, never give up, and persistently strive for our dreams. But what if the truth lies in a completely different approach? What if it is the excessive attachment to the outcome that becomes the very obstacle hindering us in our personal lives, careers, and even in achieving inner balance? Carl Jung, a prominent psychologist, proposed a concept that may seem unusual. The more we try to control the course of events, the more life eludes us. Today we will explore why letting go of control can be the key to true freedom. Stay with us, because changing your perspective on this issue can fundamentally alter your perception of the world. The more we cling to a specific idea of how things should be, the faster what we desire slips away. Attachments that, in theory, should give us a sense of security and confidence often lead to disappointment. The paradox is that by releasing control over a situation, we allow life to flow naturally. Jung once noted, "What you chase runs away from you, and what you accept transforms." In modern society, relentless effort, comprehensive control, and continuous striving for new achievements are praised, creating the illusion that peace and harmony are always just over the horizon. However, this obsessive need to control everything often becomes the main obstacle to something genuine and sincere. This is not about passive resignation or indifference, but about a more delicate maneuver, a shift from a position of omnipotence to conscious presence. Carl Jung, delving deeply into the study of the human psyche, offered a valuable key to understanding this transformation. In his opinion, renunciation is not a manifestation of emotional insensitivity, but a necessary psychological act for the ego. The ego must free itself from its projections to allow something true to manifest. In other words, as long as our consciousness is absorbed in what we project onto others, be it our desires, idealized visions of the future, we are deprived of the opportunity to objectively assess our internal state. Naturally, everyone strives for success in their endeavors. However, the problem arises when self-esteem and identity become inextricably linked to the final result, when the personal self is identified with success and relationships are viewed as a source of recognition. In such cases, failure, loss, or even the silence of another person is perceived as a serious threat to existence. This is where fear, anxiety, and desperate attempts to control every aspect of life originate. Carl Jung hypothesized that the permanent state of tension that a person experiences is nothing more than a manifestation of the ego's activity, striving to preserve fragile illusions. Genuine changes occur when an individual consciously abandons the fruitless struggle with the inevitable course of events, not out of a sense of defeat, but thanks to newfound clarity. Abandoning control over a situation should not be seen as a sign of waning strength, but as providing an opportunity for something fundamentally new to arise, not solely dependent on human will. This is an act of trust in the higher intelligence that governs the experience of life. When this gesture is dictated by a sincere impulse, what previously seemed chaotic and meaningless begins to take on clear outlines and inner logic. Disparate elements align into a unified system without visible effort, opportunities arise without obsessive striving for them, and the state of anxiety and worry transforms into conscious presence in the here and now. Abandoning control does not imply renouncing cherished dreams or the surrounding world. It is, first and foremost, liberation from obsessive compulsion, an escape from the confines of the prison called "this must happen," and an entry into the space of conscious observation of what is happening. A person who has ceased to identify with the object of their passionate pursuit inevitably approaches an understanding of their true essence. It is at this moment, without unnecessary pomp and fanfare, that all the elements of their life begin to miraculously come together into a single whole. However, what happens if the attachment, which is the main obstacle to self-realization, is directed not at another person, but at the qualities and traits with which we have endowed them in our minds? It should be recognized that attachment is rarely directed solely at another person. It is almost always about the projections and expectations that we place on them. We project onto them the role of savior, a source of validation for our own worth, a role they often didn't even seek to assume. Jung repeatedly emphasized that the aspects of our personality we stubbornly refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, we tend to notice in the people around us in an idealized or distorted form. It is in this inaccurately calibrated reflection that a painful attachment is born, hindering our progress. The ego, driven by an insatiable thirst for control and universal recognition, seeks to subjugate the world around it, as if it were an integral part of its own essence. Often, when a strong attachment arises to a specific person, a certain social status or an ambitious goal, it is not because of their intrinsic value, but because our own unrealized needs and desires are projected onto them. The desire for universal love can transform into a painful emotional dependence, and the fear of being insignificant and unnoticed into a manic obsession with success. What is mistakenly taken for genuine love or noble ambition often turns out to be a desperate attempt to fill a gaping inner void. Such projections act like warped lenses, distorting the perception of reality. Instead of seeing the people around us as they truly are, we tend to see in them only a reflection of our own desires and fantasies. It is because of this that a feeling of deep disappointment arises, because no one can forever play a role that is not intended for them. Attachment is an illusory symbiosis, generating the false belief. If I keep you close, if I earn your love, if I control your every step, then I will find the long-awaited completeness. However, such completeness is false and extremely vulnerable, since it depends entirely on the stability of external factors that are beyond our control. As Carl Jung astutely observed, the psyche, resorting to the mechanism of projection, desperately tries to protect itself from unconscious contents, the integration of which it is not yet ready for. It is much easier to believe that others reject and do not accept us than to face the painful truth about our own inadequacy. It is easier to blame the world for our own failures and mental anguish than to admit that we ourselves once discarded a part of ourselves, renounced our own integrity. When the veil of projections falls away, order reigns in the soul. One begins to understand that the attraction to another is rooted not so much in their personality as in one's own unexplored depths. It is then that reality is transformed. The image of the other ceases to be a reflection of personal needs, and they appear simply as a separate person with their own inner world. Getting rid of projections is a painful process, but one that grants freedom. This is the first step on the path to sincerity with oneself, and therefore with the world around us. When one manages to recognize the inflated ego striving for total control, a space for conscious presence opens up. Connection with the world is built not on the desire to possess, but on genuine unity. But what happens when projections collapse? The ego, seized with panic, tries to subdue the unyielding. There is a huge difference between having a goal and a manic desire to control everything. A goal is born from inner harmony, and control from fear disguised as confidence. One desperately tries to anticipate, plan, and control every step, naively believing that this will bring security. But in reality, excessive control is just a desperate attempt by the ego to avoid the inevitable, life's uncertainty. According to Carl Jung, a neurotic state is a kind of substitute for genuine suffering, a kind of psychological prosthesis. In this context, the desire for control acts as an anesthetic, blunting the sharpness of experiences. Instead of delving into the depths of feelings, one focuses on developing strategies, creating mental constructs designed to protect against painful experiences. Sensitivity, like a fragile flower, hides behind the armor of routine, ambitious goals, and unachievable promises. It seems that total control over the situation can protect against the existential pain inherent in human existence. However, control is only an illusion of life, a semblance of being in a sterile, artificial cocoon. The desire to eliminate unpredictability, this integral part of being, inevitably leads to the extinction of spontaneity, the very force that fills life with bright colors, freshness, and authenticity. Interpersonal relationships turn into a soulless mechanism, professional activity becomes an unbearable burden, and everyday life, even saturated with tasks, yawns with emptiness. The inflated ego, intoxicated by the belief in its own omnipotence, convinces itself that it is capable of coping with any challenges. It insistently asserts the existence of a single correct path, a kind of ideal template for achievement, and any deviation from this imposed model evokes a painful sense of guilt, fear, and self-criticism. The mind, like an operating system overloaded with multiple simultaneously running programs, falls into a state of hyperactivity. In this case, mental and emotional exhaustion is not a personal tragedy, but rather a natural consequence of the chosen mode of operation. At the very core of human nature, the desire for control often masks a deep-seated fear of submission. However, submission should not be seen as capitulation, but rather as an acknowledgement of the existence of forces, both within us and in the external world, that are beyond our direct control. Carl Jung, the eminent Swiss psychoanalyst, viewed the unconscious not as a passive reservoir of repressed desires, but as a dynamic, autonomous intelligence actively involved in shaping our reality. When we neglect this inner dimension, we become trapped in rational thinking, naively believing that all problems can be solved solely at the level of the conscious mind. Therefore, relinquishing total control represents an act of trust, an acknowledgement that even in chaos there is wisdom, and that unpredictability can become an unexpected but valuable guide. This is not a call for inaction or a lack of goals, but rather an invitation to open up space for spontaneity, to allow life to surprise us. This happens extremely rarely when we desperately try to control every detail, even silence. Paradoxically, the stronger our desire for everything to go according to a pre-established plan, the further we distance ourselves from our true essence. Conversely, the more we allow ourselves to listen, observe, and feel, without resorting to immediate intervention, the clearer we realize that life has its own unique rhythm, and that this rhythm has an amazing ability to guide us along the right path. What if true freedom lies not in total control, but in allowing the ego to transform? This process of approaching one's true essence is the moment when the ego, exhausted by fruitless attempts to control everything, begins to gradually loosen its grip and turns to a deeper aspect of the personality, the self. The self, in essence, is the center of psychic organization, the embodiment of the fullness of being. It is not the social I or any role that an individual plays in society, but who he or she really is when all masks are removed and pretense ceases. As long as the ego dominates, a person's life is built around external expectations and social norms, how to behave, how to look, what others expect of them. Liberation from these imposed notions is the beginning of the journey back, not to the past, but to one's original essence. Carl Jung called this complex and multifaceted process individuation, becoming who you really are, integrating the conscious and unconscious aspects of the personality. This path is not a purely theoretical construct. It begins with small but significant changes in behavior, when a person stops reacting to situations in the usual old pattern, when he realizes that he no longer needs to maintain a certain role. For example, when a relationship ends, and instead of frantically searching for a replacement for the departed partner, the individual finds the courage to be alone with the resulting void and face it. These moments of letting go of the old are a kind of portal that does not promise the immediate arrival of comfort and well-being, but opens up new horizons for the manifestation of genuine authenticity. True humility originates in the ego's awareness of its own limitations, in the recognition that it no longer needs to play the role of the all-knowing and all-powerful. It is at this moment that something secret and quiet is born in the depths of the soul. The self does not manifest itself obtrusively or loudly, but guides a person with quiet confidence. Its guidance does not stem from logical deductions, but from an inner sense of harmony, from what resonates with the soul, what feels right, even if it cannot be immediately explained. This process of letting go, far from being passive, represents a more subtle form of presence in the moment. It is an action performed without the obsessive idea of achieving a result, a love that does not require mandatory reciprocity, and/or creation that does not need to prove its own significance. This state is governed not by the need for recognition, but by an internal consistency that does not require applause to confirm its value. In the process of individuation, the ego does not disappear without a trace, but undergoes a transformation of its role. Instead of claiming to possess absolute truth, it begins to serve the self. This inner shift impacts all aspects of life. Relationships become more genuine, decisions gain meaning, and life, which once seemed like a battlefield, appears as a gift to simply live. Letting go in this context is not a loss, but an integration. It's allowing what must leave to leave and freeing up space for the new to emerge. In this act, we stop playing imposed roles and begin to live as whole individuals. Before the self can assert itself, another protective layer must be shed, the persona. This concept, central to Jung's teachings, refers to the social mask an individual wears in pursuit of social recognition. The persona undoubtedly plays an important role as we exist in society. However, the problem arises when a person excessively identifies with this mask, beginning to live to maintain an artificial image rather than in accordance with their own truth. Striving to appear strong, spiritually evolved, successful, or to be an exemplary child, each of these aspirations, despite seeming positive and even noble, carries significant costs. The need to constantly monitor oneself to maintain the created image leads to exhaustion and, worse, alienation from one's own essence. A person living under the burden of constantly playing a role cannot fully unlock their potential. Jung viewed the persona as a necessary but limited tool, serving as a bridge between the inner and outer worlds. Difficulties begin when a person forgets the existence of something more beyond this mask, when attachment to the image becomes so strong that any threat to its destruction evokes fear, anger, and a defensive reaction. In such a case, a person ceases to live a real life and focuses on managing the impression they make. Liberation begins with the realization that there is no need to maintain a constant narrative about oneself. A person has the right to make mistakes, to change their mind, to be contradictory. There is no need to be in agreement with who they were yesterday. It is enough to be sincere with what they feel in the moment. It is from this state that authenticity is born, even if it does not find universal approval. Rejecting the mask imposed by society is a bold and decisive act, requiring the courage to appear before the world without the usual protection to allow oneself to be authentic, even if it threatens to destroy an image carefully created over the years. However, this step provides incredible liberation, like an actor leaving a failed scene and, taking a deep breath, beginning to speak in their own name. As Jung perceptively noted, a look into the external world immerses one in a world of dreams, while turning to the inner world leads to awakening. Attachment to a created image is a kind of illusion, a conviction that we are only what we show to others. True awakening comes when we turn our gaze inward and realize the complexity and multifaceted nature of our personality, which no mask can contain. And it is in this awareness that true full-blooded life begins. Behind this carefully concealed mask lies what we fear most to see, our shadow, the dark side of our personality. The freedom that many seek is both alluring and frightening. Few are ready to face it with honesty and openness, because being free means losing the ability to hide behind others, behind imposed roles or empty promises. It means accepting full responsibility for oneself, including those aspects of one's personality that we prefer to ignore. And it is there, in the depths of our subconscious, that the shadow dwells. In Carl Jung's analytical psychology, the shadow appears as a collection of suppressed elements of the psyche, those aspects of personality that an individual consciously rejects, ignores, or considers unacceptable for themselves. It is important to note that the shadow is not synonymous with evil. Rather, it is an area of the hidden, consisting of qualities and impulses that do not correspond to the image of the ideal I that a person has created. The paradox is that the stronger the denial of these shadow aspects, the more powerful influence they exert on a person's life, acting from behind the scenes of consciousness. Consider the example of a person experiencing strong attachment, who, while declaring a desire for freedom, actually experiences a panic fear of the phenomena that accompany it, a sense of inner emptiness, silence, the absence of external confirmation of one's own significance. In such cases, an individual desperately clings to another person, a specific job, or an idealized vision of the future, driven not by love or genuine interest, but by a deep-seated fear of what will be revealed when these supports disappear. It is at this point that the process of letting go becomes excruciatingly painful, as it involves not only freeing oneself from external objects of attachment, but also taking a courageous look within. Existential questions arise. What remains when hopes and desires prove unattainable? What surfaces when relationships end, carefully constructed plans crumble, and the created image of oneself turns to dust? It is in this exposed, vulnerable space that the shadow manifests, and its appearance is rarely gentle or delicate. Often it appears in the form of rage, envy, deep sadness, the very feelings that a person refuses to acknowledge in themselves. However, to successfully navigate this complex inner tunnel, considerable courage is required, a willingness to face the unappealing reality of one's inner world without attempting to embellish or distort one's experience. According to Carl Jung, the path to enlightenment lies through the inevitable confrontation with the dark sides of one's own soul. This process of transformation becomes possible when an individual ceases to fear their shadow, thereby depriving it of its hidden power. The integration of these previously rejected aspects, whether needs, fears, or vulnerabilities, allows one to accept them as integral parts of oneself, not succumbing to their influence but learning to control them. In this context, letting go transforms from a simple gesture of farewell to another person into an encounter with those aspects that were once rejected. The shadow appears not as an obstacle on the path to a fulfilling life, but as a necessary element that must be embraced in order to attain that fullness. Only those who boldly traverse this inner space, uncovering the truth about themselves, can experience true freedom, independent of any external circumstances save their own essence. However, the shadow can manifest where it is least expected, in the bonds that are commonly called love. Often people mistakenly take need for love, and the line between a genuine desire to be with someone and an irrational fear of loneliness can be subtle, yet of immense importance. Jung argued that true love begins where projections end. As long as a person is attached to what another person represents in their eyes, they are unable to see them as they truly are, and often do not see themselves either. At the beginning of a relationship, the idealization of a partner is a natural phenomenon, masquerading as a strong feeling. The need for emotional salvation, security, and even a sense of identity is projected onto the other person, unconsciously forming dependence. As a result, the other person ceases to be perceived as an independent individual, turning into a role, a function. At such moments, genuine love, manifested in tenderness and intimacy, is replaced by its sinister shadow, fear. This fear is skillfully disguised as love, but at its core lies the fear of loss, a sense of one's own inadequacy, and the dread of confronting oneself. The other person becomes a necessary condition for one's own well-being, and their detachment is perceived as a personal catastrophe, leading to the disintegration of the personality. However, such love, based on acute need, has nothing to do with true connection. It is more like a contract concluded between two insecure people. What remains when these painful bonds weaken? Often it is discovered that one does indeed have warm feelings for the other person, but it also becomes clear that they served as a kind of shield, protecting one from the unaccepted aspects of one's own personality. To let go in this context does not mean to stop loving. It means to start loving truly, in its purest form. It means allowing the other person to be themselves, without the need to occupy a key place in one's emotional structure. It means loving without the desire to possess, building relationships with a real person, not with a projection created by one's own imagination. Such an approach requires maturity and awareness that the other person is free, that they can change, that they have the right to leave, and despite all this, they deserve respect and kind feelings. It also implies a deep inner restructuring. Instead of seeking the missing completeness in another person, it is necessary to find an inner foundation that allows one to love without losing oneself. True love, devoid of the desire for possession and control, is not characterized by coldness or detachment. On the contrary, it is distinguished by a greater degree of presence and involvement, since its roots do not lie in the soil of fear. This love is filled with tranquility, but at the same time possesses incredible depth. It represents a union where we doesn't erase the individual I, allowing two personalities to be together without dissolving into each other, but rather enriching each other with their completeness. When the veil of projections falls, it's time for genuine connection, a connection that may be imperfect, but is entirely real. It's a meeting of two minds that don't seek annihilation or merging, but instead strive to know each other and, as a result, allow themselves to love freely and consciously. However, maintaining the game of pretense and dependence comes at a cost. It requires the expenditure of vital energy. A moment arrives when attempts to maintain this illusion fail. The personality, formed under the pressure of expectations, demands, and imposed patterns, begins to crumble. The strength that once seemed a source of control turns into an unbearable burden. The fatigue, mistaken for physical exhaustion, reveals its true nature. The ego is depleted. This exhaustion isn't a manifestation of laziness or weakness, but rather a silent cry of the unconscious, a forced pause, as if an inner voice says, "It's no longer possible to pretend." It's at this moment that the true self begins to emerge, not with euphoria and delight, but with a special calmness that comes with the completion of something important. Carl Jung interpreted profound personal crises as persistent calls to recognize the truth. Moments when a person's inner world descends into chaos often indicate preparation for a fundamental restructuring at a higher level. The widespread emotional burnout in modern society should be seen not only as a consequence of an overabundance of external stimuli, but also as a result of an excessive number of social masks, multiple roles, and inflated expectations that conflict with the individual's true feelings and needs. A life devoted to maintaining a certain image requires colossal energy expenditure. One must constantly control their words, emotions, and reactions, remaining in a state of continuous tension. However, when the body refuses to obey, the mind becomes blocked and the will fades. It signals the need to pay attention to the deep questions of self-identity. Who are you without imposed roles and expectations? In this critical moment, abandoning the familiar becomes not an escape from reality, but genuine liberation. There's an awareness that there's no longer a need for exhausting struggle and constant self-affirmation. There's an opportunity to stop and feel that disappearance won't occur. On the contrary, there's a chance to manifest oneself in a more authentic form. The ego resists this process, fearing that without relentless effort, everything will collapse. However, submitting to circumstances isn't capitulation, but a manifestation of high mental intelligence, recognizing the existence of boundaries and understanding that forcibly overcoming them leads only to devastation. Jung argued that ignoring the needs of the psyche leads to various symptoms, while attentive attention to them opens new paths of development. Fatigue from a social role is an invitation to take a sincere breath outside the usual image, to reflect on what really matters, and to acknowledge that sometimes, before moving on, it's necessary to simply rest, shed the burden of constant performance, and allow something authentic to manifest in the space of this pause. In moments of downfall, a person is overtaken by a deep emotional wound, often unspoken, longing for unrealized potential. There's much talk about the liberating power of letting go, but rarely is there mention of the accompanying pain. After all, letting go is a kind of demise, not physical but symbolic, sometimes no less painful. Farewell to a dream, broken relationships, collapsed plans for the future. All this causes grief over lost opportunities, and this grief is very real. Carl Jung viewed suffering not as an annoying mistake to be immediately corrected, but as an integral part of the process of personal transformation. Without death, there is no rebirth, he asserted, emphasizing the cyclical nature of life both in the external and internal world of man. When it's time to part with something, be it an unrealized idea, a faded love, or an outdated identity, a painful break occurs, and each such break, even if necessary, causes suffering. In this context, letting go appears not as a cold-blooded rational decision, but as a deep emotional process, often plunging a person into a whirlpool of doubt and silence. When the sense of support disappears and sensitivity dulls, a crushing emptiness arises, as if the ground is slipping from under one's feet. And although this emptiness holds the potential for something new, it is, of course, frightening. At this moment, the personality is torn by conflicting emotions, relief from deliverance and a poignant sadness for what is lost, a sense of freedom and oppressive loneliness, a sudden surge of courage and paralyzing fear of the unknown. All of this is an integral part of the mental anguish caused not only by the loss itself, but also by the collapse of an idealized image, unfulfilled hopes, and the ruin of an internal scenario that will never come to fruition. The ego, craving control and certainty, suffers from this, demanding immediate answers, clear meaning, and a precise understanding of the reasons for failure. However, the self, the deepest essence of the personality, operates according to a different, more complex and cyclical logic that defies linear thinking. Sometimes it is precisely what does not come to pass that becomes a powerful impetus for self-analysis, a re-evaluation of established values, a revision of fundamental principles, and the abandonment of a plan that may have long ceased to correspond to true needs, even though it still seemed familiar and safe. A respectful attitude towards this grief is as important as the ability to let go of the past, because only by going through the pain, not denying its existence and not trying to run away from it, can one truly transform and achieve new wholeness. This is not about clinging to suffering and cultivating it, but about consciously living through it, not missing a single detail. Suffering, experienced with full awareness, has its time and its meaning, and it is during this period that something new and valuable matures in the depths of the soul. The ability to let go is also the art of dealing with invisible losses, those that leave no visible traces or scars on the body, but deeply wound the soul, leaving a gaping void. And it is in this barely noticeable scar that new life gradually begins to emerge, not as a promise of something specific, but as a boundless possibility. When what bound you to the past finally dissolves, something amazing and unexpected happens. The world does not collapse, as it might have seemed at first, but, on the contrary, rebuilds and reorganizes itself, acquiring new forms and outlines. The silence that once frightened with its uncertainty becomes fertile ground for new beginnings, and the emptiness that caused fear and anxiety transforms into a boundless space for self-realization and creativity. And it is in this space that those sprouts begin to grow that could not have come into being while everything was occupied by control, fruitless expectations, and the intrusive noise of the outside world. It's like opening a window after years of confinement in a stuffy room. Sunlight penetrates inside, highlighting dust particles dancing in the air, and a fresh wind brings change and renewal. At first, there is an unusual sensation, a kind of quiet discomfort, but gradually breathing returns, restoring the feeling of the present moment. The mind ceases its chaotic race and begins to listen to the body, the flow of time, and the subtle signs of life. Imagine a person who has spent years in a relationship where the genuine exchange of feelings has long faded, but continued to cling to it out of fear, attachment, or ingrained habit. And then when this person finally breaks free, not only from the other person, but also from the illusion that this relationship can still be saved, they are struck by shock, silence, and a sense of emptiness. But immediately after this, a new space emerges. In this space, they regain the ability to create. They write without compulsion. They feel the desire to be alone, to enjoy music in the dark, to do something that requires no one's approval. This return to creativity comes not from a sense of duty, but as a need to express oneself. Psychologist Jung spoke of the psychic energy that is released when we stop feeding our ego. All the resources that previously went into maintaining a certain image, controlling the future, or resisting the present become available, and this energy demands an outlet. That's when creativity is born, not only in art but in existence itself. Creativity is not just creating a painting or writing a poem. It is reinterpreting one's own life with full awareness. It is rearranging furniture in the house, choosing a new route, changing the usual rhythm. It is transforming past suffering into worldly wisdom. Creativity originates where a person stops automatically reacting to external stimuli and begins to consciously make choices. And this becomes possible only when free space appears. In this unique state, the inner voice of intuition gains strength and clarity. Previously suppressed by fears and doubts, it now sounds clear and confident, guiding the person to new discoveries. Hidden connections between phenomena are noticed, in which previously only unsolvable problems were seen. Inspiration often strikes unexpectedly. A fresh idea surfaces during a relaxing shower, and a long-awaited answer comes easily and naturally, like a reward for days of intense searching. The exhausting pursuit of finding a solution at all costs ceases, giving way to the ability to feel and perceive the world around you. Time stops being a ruthless adversary, and each day lived no longer resembles a battlefield. Slowing down the pace of life happens not because of fatigue or apathy, but thanks to inner peace and harmony with oneself. Decisions are made with ease, as the need to prove something to someone or meet someone else's expectations disappears. Surprisingly, what seemed unattainable begins to come on its own, and this is not magic, but the result of liberation from internal obstacles and limitations. Consider an artist whose creative potential is constrained by excessive demands on himself. He strives so hard to create something brilliant that he loses the ability to create at all. But one day, exhausted and disappointed, he lets go of the situation, puts his work aside, and allows himself to rest. Going for a walk or on a spontaneous trip, he unexpectedly finds a new idea, born in freedom and ease. This is the power of letting go. When a person frees himself from obsessive thoughts and expectations, the true returns to his life or finally gets the opportunity to manifest itself. The state of creative freedom, a deep connection with the true self, is the complete opposite of the logic of the ego. If the ego strives for control, guarantees, and tangible results, then the self, on the contrary, seeks self-expression, truth, and inner harmony. When the ego cedes its central position, the self gently and naturally takes over. It does not force, but guides, shows the way without resorting to violence. It manifests itself through those activities and hobbies that bring sincere joy, even if they go unnoticed by others or do not lead to immediate results. It is at this moment that letting go reveals its true beauty. It is not just a loss, but rather a transformation, a bridge between the past and the future, between who a person was trying to prove something and who he is in reality, when it is enough to simply be himself. Letting go returns a person to himself, freeing him from everything superfluous, from the noise and weight that no longer belong to him. The space that opens up after letting go is not a frightening void, but fertile ground waiting for sincere presence. In this space, life does not shout, but whispers, and a person, becoming more attentive and internally cleansed, begins to hear its voice. Ultimately, it all comes down to a simple and quiet gesture of opening the palm, letting go of illusions, fears, and recurring scenarios, not out of exhaustion, although sometimes it is the starting point, but out of clear awareness. There comes a moment when holding on becomes more painful and burdensome than the loss itself. Attachment, no matter how familiar it may seem, is not true love. It is born of fear, a sense of lack, and an attempt to hold on to something that may have already fulfilled its role. To love is to allow another person or phenomenon to exist, to allow life to flow its course, even if it does not meet personal expectations. Control, in turn, is not a sign of strength, but only a more sophisticated form of resistance. It is the ego trying to subordinate reality to its desires. However, a life built on such logic turns into constant tension and conflict with the present moment, which no soul can endure for long. Carl Jung, an outstanding thinker, argued that true healing comes not through the violent imposition of change, but through a deep acceptance of existing reality. This is the moment when a person abandons the fruitless struggle with the flow of life and begins to listen carefully to its wisdom. Abandoning the pursuit of illusory ideals and looking boldly in the face of the present is the path to transformation. Acceptance is by no means a surrender. It is rather openness to new experiences, an open door through which true transformation enters. In this regard, the question naturally arises, what are we so desperately holding on to? What image of ourselves, what expectations are firmly entrenched in our minds, preventing the arrival of fresh opportunities? What will happen if we let go of these outdated concepts and allow ourselves to finally take a deep breath? Letting go is certainly associated with risk, but clinging to the past can be just as dangerous. Often being held captive by one's own illusions is much more destructive than the fear of the unknown. After all, our purpose is not to play an imposed role, but to live a full, rich life. Authentic living requires courage, the courage to shed the masks that no longer reflect our true selves, the courage to move closer to what truly matters, the courage to simply be ourselves. Life begins where the illusion of control ends. It is in that quiet innermost place that we return to our true selves, not as an ideal image, but as a living presence, and then everything that has true value finds its way to us.